Welcome to Tech Tales. I'm Corbin Davenport,
And I'm Cody Toombs.
and today we are talking about Apple's transition to Intel processors. Back in the mid 2000s, when Apple switched all of their Mac computers from PowerPC to Intel chips, and that is more interesting than it sounds, I promise.
Well, you've roped me into it, so I hope.
Yeah, so before we talk about moving away from PowerPC processors, I need to talk a little bit about how they moved to PowerPC processors. Why did this happen? So, in 1991, Apple, Motorola, and IBM teamed up to create the PowerPC CPU architecture. This is when the Windows and Intel duopoly was really getting started, and there was a fear that that combo would just rule the entire computer market, which eventually it did. This was kind of all three companies working together on different parts. So IBM and Motorola were working on the processors. Apple would make Macs with the PowerPC processors, and they also had a licensing program. This was back when any company could make a Mac clone if it wanted to. So you would have other companies licensing Apple's operating system with one of the chips from Motorola or IBM. And Apple ported its Macintosh operating system to PowerPC and released the first Mac with a PowerPC processor in 1994. So that's kind of when this got started. Apple was not the only one building computers with PowerPC chips. IBM and Motorola were also building complete workstations. Those were usually running a mix of either Unix, Solaris OS, or Windows NT. There was actually a Windows NT port to PowerPC. It wasn't supported for very long, but there was one. The initial PowerPC 601, 603, and 604 processors were pretty impressive. They could beat a lot of Intel's comparable CPUs in benchmarks. The PowerPC 700 series was introduced in 1997. That's what Apple called the PowerPC G3. And it had a faster system bus, dynamic branch prediction, and higher core counts. One of Apple's advertising campaigns touted that a Power Mac G3 was up to twice as fast as a Pentium 2 PC. And then the PowerPC 7400, which was also known as the G4, was introduced in late 1999 and continued to compete pretty well against Intel's best processors. The G4 added a new high bandwidth system bus called MPX. It improved multi-CPU operation, so you could have a Mac with multiple G4 chips in it. It had faster floating point math calculations, and it had a vector processor called AltaVec. In October 2003, IBM announced the PowerPC 970, which Apple would call the PowerPC G5. And this is when it kind of starts to unravel. So the PowerPC G5 used a newer 64-bit instruction set, so Apple advertised its Power Mac G5 as like one of the first 64-bit workstations you could buy. One thing that's kind of interesting is that the 64-bit PowerPC architecture retained compatibility with 32-bit applications, which is something that AMD would later do when they made a 64-bit version of x86. The initial PowerPC 970 had a CPU clock speed of 1.6 gigahertz, and it could boost to 2 gigahertz. And Apple claimed the first Power Mac G5 ran Photoshop twice as fast as a PC with a Pentium 4 or dual Intel Xeon processors. So, that sounds good.
I mean, I want to buy one.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there were problems.
Do tell.
The G5 is kind of interesting because it was based on IBM's Power 4 CPU for servers. And because it was designed for servers, it was designed for performance more than power consumption. So the G5 was an incredibly power-hungry chip. So much so that Apple's Power Mac G5 tower needed more sophisticated cooling systems to deal with the increased heat output from these chips. The initial G5 had 9 cooling fans in it to try to keep this computer cool. Another issue is that even like using all this power, it still wasn't quite what Apple wanted. When the Power Mac G5 was introduced in 2003, Steve Jobs said that a 3 gigahertz model would be available within a year. But IBM couldn't deliver on that promise. They just could not make a G5 that could push 3 gigahertz.
I think it's worth just noting, by today's standards, if somebody's talking about making a server for performance, heat actually is now heat and power users are now a serious consideration. They're important now. At the time, if you said, "Oh yeah, we're making a server chip," no one would bat an eye. They'd be like, "Oh yeah, sure, feed as much power into it as you like. It can get as hot as you like as long as we can cool it." Like, that was the notion of servers then versus now.
Yeah. So IBM later released an updated PowerPC 970FX chip, which could get to 2.5 gigahertz, but still not 3. Apple updated the Power Mac G5 in 2004 with that new CPU. The highest end model had 2 of them, and that dual CPU model required liquid cooling because it's so hot.
This sounds so unlike anything Apple would even consider making today.
Yeah, Apple's making like a gaming PC just to run Photoshop faster.
I wonder if this is why they turned away from talking about specs for so long.
Yeah, I mean that was something I was thinking about when reading these old press releases, which are all in the show notes as the source link, so you can go read them. How like every announcement about new Macs was always focused on like clock speeds, and that's something that like just doesn't happen today. Like Apple doesn't do that, but also a lot of other companies don't. Partially just because like, you know, we're not getting like 2x performance improvements in computers every 2 years anymore. So, and the focus again, kind of like what you were saying earlier, is about power efficiency more than it is higher number on my computer.
Plus, it's not even necessarily about performance all the time as it is maybe specific features or functions that maybe they do relate to performance, sort of like AI cores now are obviously really critical to AI performance, but you might not necessarily care about how well it can handle, I don't know, multi-threaded math calculations or something like that stuff. In a lot of cases, people don't need more performance than they have. But when you're talking about AI calculations, yeah, well, you could use a lot more than whatever you could do on your previous chip.
Right. The like average computer experience now is not determined so much by a clock speed. It's determined by like, oh, do you have a specialized, CPU core for this thing?
Yeah.
Another funny thing about that dual core model is in all of Apple's marketing, they called that computer quad core because it was 2 dual core CPUs. So it's like,
okay.
I guess.
I mean, technically they're not wrong, but
they're technically correct.
Yeah.
So Apple did successfully shove that processor into a Power Mac. Apple also released the iMac G5, which is their like all-in-one computer with the screen on it. For that computer, they actually underclocked the data bus to help reduce power draw in heat because the iMac was in more of a slim profile, so it was easier for that to get overheated. And I don't think that had liquid cooling.
I wouldn't think so, no.
No. So because the G5 was so power hungry and generated too much heat, IBM could not make a PowerPC G5 processor that was suitable for any of Apple's laptops or the Mac Mini desktop, which was like their small, compact desktop computer. So those product lines were stuck on G4 chips. The PowerPC G5 CPU used a maximum of 100 watts of power when running at 2.5 gigahertz and 1.3 volts. And you would need really bulky and heavy cooling systems to fit that in a laptop. And of course, Apple being Apple, did not want to sell a thick with 3 Cs PowerBook just to accommodate a G5. The other option would have been to reduce the clock speed of the G5, kind of like they did in the iMac, enough to make the cooling practical, but then it wouldn't really be much faster than the G4 chips they were putting in those computers, if at all. Apple marketing executive David Moody told CNET in 2005 that, quote, "It is fair to say that incorporating a G5 into a notebook as thin and light as the PowerBook is extremely difficult," quote. And Tim Cook, who was Apple's worldwide sales and operations vice president at the time, said that putting a G5 in a PowerBook was, quote, "the mother of all thermal challenges."
So, yeah, they downplayed it.
Yeah.
They're being modest.
Yeah. It's just the laptop that burns you instantly if they put a G5 in there. Also, around this time, IBM was reportedly worried about the profitability of its low-volume CPU business because Apple was really the only large customer at this point. I think Nintendo was shipping the GameCube with a PowerPC chip in it, and there were some other embedded applications, but it wasn't anywhere close to the scale of like Intel selling CPUs for Windows PCs. And at the same time, Apple wanted a larger variety of PowerPC chips for its computers. At this point, they were actually buying CPUs from 2 companies. So they were buying the G4 PowerPC chips from Freescale, which was spun off from Motorola. And IBM was the only company building G5s. All these issues meant that Apple started to look elsewhere for chips for the Mac. Mac OS X was released in 2001, and we did a whole series about that. You can go back and listen to The Road to OS X.
It was quite good.
It was. And OS X was based on the OpenStep technology that Apple acquired when it bought Next in 1997. And OpenStep was designed to run on x86 initially. I think it might have supported other chips, but it could be easily ported and maintained on multiple architectures. So early developer previews of Mac OS X, back when it was called Rhapsody, were available for both PowerPC and x86 processors. So they actually made like a dev preview you could install on like a normal PC. The final release of Mac OS X was only available for PowerPC Macs, but Apple secretly continued to build OS X and its core applications for x86 processors as a backup plan. So all this culminated in WWDC 2005, where Apple finally confirmed that it would move away from PowerPC processors. And we're going to watch a video of that.
Okay, I am at 2154.
Okay, go on 3, 2, 1, play.
We want to constantly be making the best computers for you and the rest of our users. And so it's time for a third transition, and yes, it's true. We are going to begin the transition from the PowerPC to Intel processors, and we are going to begin it for you now and for our customers next year. Now, why are we going to do this? Right? Didn't we just get through going from OS 9 to OS 10? Isn't the business great right now? Why do we want another transition? Because we want to be making the best computers for our customer looking forward. Now, I stood up here 2 years ago in front of you, and I promised you this. And we haven't been able to deliver that to you yet. I think a lot of you would like a G5 in your PowerBook, and we haven't been able to deliver that to you yet. But these aren't even the most important reasons. The most important reasons are that as we look ahead, though we have great products right now, and we've got some great PowerPC products still yet to come, as we look ahead, we can envision some amazing products we want to build for you. And we don't know how to build them with the future PowerPC roadmap. And that's why we're going to do this. When we look at Intel, they've got great performance, yes. But they've got something else that's very important to us. Just as important as performance is power consumption. And the way we look at it is performance per watt. For 1 watt of power, how much performance do you get? And when we look at the future roadmaps projected out mid-2006 and beyond, what we see is the PowerPC gives us sort of 15 units of performance per watt. But the Intel roadmap in the future gives us 70. And so this tells us what we have to do.
So this is kind of a complicated hardware transition. So Apple developed a few different technologies to make this as seamless as possible. The first thing they built, which is kind of cool, is universal binaries, which allow developers to create a single application package with both Intel and PowerPC code. So people wouldn't get confused about which app version was for their specific map. And this was also back when like software on CDs was more common, or DVDs. So you could just put one thing on the DVD and it would work for everyone. Apple actually did that same thing back when they moved from 68K chips to PowerPC. They had, I think they were called fat binaries that had the code for both in them. The other cool thing is the Rosetta compatibility layer, which allowed existing unmodified PowerPC apps to run on Intel Macs using dynamic binary translation. This layer wasn't perfect. Rosetta supported applications with G3, G4, and AltaVec instructions, but not G5 instructions. And Rosetta also didn't support kernel extensions, screensavers, emulators like Microsoft's Virtual PC, and some other edge cases. That all was kind of understandable. But the core thing is like a bunch of apps and games made for PowerPC would just run on Intel Macs, and it would just be this like invisible layer doing it. You wouldn't even really notice it. Also, an interesting thing with this transition is that the classic environment in Mac OS X for running older classic Mac software, like from Mac OS 9 and earlier, was not ported to Intel. So this was the final like end of all classic Mac support, is if you bought an Intel Mac, you're just not running that stuff. So, you know, it's good that backwards compatibility exists, but Apple still has the issue where they need to get developers to rewrite their apps again for Intel chips, after a lot of them just did that for OS X a couple years prior. Apple said that most Mac apps with a modern Cocoa database could be recompiled for Intel within a few days, and then if the developers had like more legacy code-based stuff, then that would probably need more work, but like their pitch to app developers was like, if you already spent all that time modernizing your code, it's not going to take that long.
It's funny how much they've basically kept telling people that over the years for every single platform, every single change that they make, and then they decided it should just become a yearly thing for iPhone developers.
Yeah. So they did have a fun segment in this WWDC 2005 event where they were talking about updating an app, and I will send you that video.
I am ready.
All right, hit play on 3, 2, 1, go.
And I want to focus on one app right here, a Corbin app written in Xcode. This is a developer I've known for a long time. I gave him a call Wednesday night, this last Wednesday night. And I said, we got something really secret we're working on, and I can't tell you what it is. But I want you to put all your source code on a hard disk and fly out here, and let's see what we can do. And it was nip and tuck there for a few minutes, but they trusted us enough to do that. And that company was Wolfram Research, and that app was not a small app. That app was Mathematica. And it is my pleasure right now to introduce Theo Gray, the co-founder of Wolfram Research, to tell us what happened in the last 5 days. Theo, welcome.
I get the most ridiculous phone calls from Apple sometimes. I mean, this was like 9 o'clock at night, and he's calling. He said, I have this great thing, and it's great, and could you port Mathematica? And, you know, I can't tell you what it is, but could you come out and show people on Monday? So, I mean, you have to understand. So Mathematica has inside it probably the world's largest collection of algorithms. It supports all kinds of programming styles, data formats of all sorts. It's built with millions of lines of C code. We've got Java code. We've got the most modern C++ template stuffy widget things, and we've got ancient code that hasn't been changed since like the Reagan administration, some of which I might have written. This is not a little toy app. This is a beast. A lot to port. But not to worry, because he said, well, there's this little checkbox, and you click the little checkbox, and you'll be fine. It'll be great. So I said, oh, okay. I'll send out our crack team of emergency Macintosh developers that we keep on standby. That would be Rob. We'll see what he can do. So we put him on a plane. He gets there Thursday afternoon. Of course, I can't actually tell him why he's going, but he showed up, and they showed him the checkbox, and he clicked the little checkbox, and 2 hours later, he had a copy of Mathematica running on Intel. 2 hours. So. For those of you that have been through a Carbon port, OS 10 kind of port, this is nothing like that. I mean, we're talking about 20 lines of source code out of millions from a dead cold start where he doesn't even know why he's showing up at Apple in 2 hours to have a working version. Let's take a look. Actually, I should say in fairness that there is an awful lot of software engineering built into Mathematica to make this kind of thing possible. There's Rob. There's help from Apple. Your mileage may vary. But from where I stand, it's pretty good when your biggest problem with a port is figuring out what to do with the rest of the weekend.
My boy Rob, he got it done.
I mean, who doesn't want to rob?
So that was Apple's pitch for Intel Macs. Is in theory, applications could be rewritten for it pretty quickly, and for all the apps that weren't, most of them would still run in a compatibility layer. And also, most end users wouldn't have to think about this all that much because the apps could just be bundled together in a single package. Now, of course, they would know when their Power Mac stopped getting new apps, and initially it was fine.
From the way you said that, it sounds like foreshadowing.
Could it be? So Apple started distributing a prototype Intel Mac to app developers after that event, after WWDC 2005. And it was called the Apple Developer Transition Kit, or DDK. It was priced at $1,000, and developers had to sign NDAs and give them back by the end of 2006 when Apple would have real Intel Macs available.
So just like the Mac Mini that they sent out, when they went to Apple Silicon.
The DTK looked basically identical to a Power Mac G5 on the outside, but it used a 3.6 gigahertz Pentium 4 processor with a preview release of macOS X 10.4.1. And that Pentium is kind of interesting because Apple never actually ended up shipping an Intel Mac with a Pentium chip. The first ones had a mix of Core 2 Duo and Core Solo chips. And I did find one picture that is very funny, and I'm going to send it to you. And this will be in the show notes as well. This is the inside of the developer kit. Now, why is this picture so funny, Cody?
This looks like the apartment of a fresh out of college guy who has no furniture. That's what this is. This is a big box with a lot of open space.
Yeah, the Power Mac G5s, when you look at pictures of the inside of them, they're very crammed together because they have to have all this crazy cooling stuff. And the picture of this is just like a PC motherboard in a mostly empty case. You see like a couple fans, there's a hard drive, and that's really it. This is mostly empty space in here.
I mean, I think it is worth noting that there's a chamber up at the top where you've got the power supply, and that's what, a disk drive?
And
yeah,
it's
CD
a DVD drive, yeah.
So, that part looks moderately packed, I guess. There's still a lot of space between them, but there should be for airflow. The lower chamber, though, which is the majority of this case, it's effectively empty. I mean, like
in modern terms, this looks like when you put a like mini ITX motherboard in like a full PC tower case.
Yeah.
That's a good visual demonstration of the power efficiency Apple is getting here. They don't need a crazy water cooler anymore to just run Photoshop. So, in January of 2006, Apple revealed the first Intel-based iMac and the first 15-inch MacBook Pro. The base model iMac had a 1.83 gigahertz Intel Core Duo processor. It had 512 megabytes of RAM, expandable to 2 gigabytes, and a 17-inch LCD screen. They also had a more expensive model that had a 2 gigahertz Core Duo CPU and a 20-inch screen. And Apple said that it was up to twice as fast as the iMac G5 it was replacing, which seems very believable to me because they had to underclock the G5 for just to put it in that computer. So that seems believable to me. The MacBook Pro, this was the first MacBook Pro because this was replacing the PowerBook lineup. The base model had a 1.67 gigahertz Intel Core Duo processor. It had 512 megabytes of RAM. You could upgrade that to 2 gigs. And a 15.4-inch LCD screen. They also had a more expensive model with a faster 1.83 gigahertz Intel Core Duo and a higher 1 gigabyte base RAM configuration. And this was actually a pretty big upgrade, not just because of the processor, but this was also Apple's first laptop with a built-in webcam, back when they called them iSight cameras.
Yeah.
And it was the first laptop with the MagSafe power connector. And Apple said this computer was up to 4 times faster than the PowerBook G4 it was replacing, because that G4 had been like stuck in time. They hadn't been able to put a faster chip in there.
It's funny how often Apple does get to make those brags. It's twice as fast, 3 times as fast, whatever. Anything in that territory. They love to be able to say that. And it usually works out because the thing that they're replacing is like
it's
several
so
years
old. Yeah. Okay, so in February of 2006, Apple revealed an Intel version of its Mac Mini desktop, and it was sold with either a 1.5 gigahertz Intel Core Solo processor or a 1.6 gigahertz Intel Core Duo processor. Same 512 megs of RAM, expandable to 2 gigabytes. Apple said this was up to 4 times faster than the G4 Mac Mini it was replacing. Again, like, makes sense. That was also on an older chip. In April of 2006, Apple released a 17-inch MacBook Pro to replace the 17-inch PowerBook. It was almost identical to that smaller MacBook Pro, except it had a slightly faster 2.6 gigahertz Intel Core Duo processor. The smaller 15-inch was either 1.67 or 1.83, so little speed boost there. That same month, Apple also announced Boot Camp, which was a feature that allowed Intel-based Macs to run Windows XP in a dual boot setup with all the supported drivers and everything. And basically how this worked is that you would run the Boot Camp app, and it would make a new partition on the Mac's hard drive, and then it would burn a CD with all the drivers on it, because that was just the easiest way to do this back then. And then you would reboot your Mac, you'd put the Windows CD in, you'd install Windows, and then you'd put in the driver CD and get all the drivers, and then you would have a Mac that could boot Mac OS and Windows, Find yourself a computer that can do both.
Which, at the time, seems impressive.
That was pretty cool. Pretty cool at the time.
Yeah.
No more virtual PC app to slowly emulate Windows XP. So the next month, in May of 2006, Apple revealed the MacBook as a replacement for their previous entry-level laptops, which was the iBook. The rest of the first generation Intel Macs looked pretty similar to the PowerPC models they were replacing, like going from the PowerBook G4 to that MacBook Pro. It kind of looked the same. Like there were a lot of important changes, but it looked like the same laptop. The first MacBook was a pretty significant design departure from the iBook G4, which again, kind of like you were saying, it made sense because the iBook G4 was about 3 years old at that point, so it's a pretty old computer. That initial MacBook had a sleek new polycarbonate plastic design, either in a white or black color, depending on which hardware configuration you got. It was 20% thinner than the iBook G4 it replaced, and the screen was 79% brighter than that iBook or the 12-inch PowerBook. Pretty good upgrades. The base model was priced at $1,099, and it had a 13.3-inch screen, 1.83 gigahertz Intel Core Duo processor, 512 megs of RAM. You could get it up to 2 gigs, a 60 gigabyte hard drive, and a built-in webcam. It had that same built-in webcam, so that's cool.
Yeah, and they owe that entirely to the processor change.
Yeah. PowerPC couldn't do webcam. Could
not do it. Did not have that ability. Couldn't
do it. Apple also sold a higher-end $1,300 MacBook with a 2 gigahertz Intel processor. And then there was another like $1,500 model with a 80 gig hard drive. Look out.
At that size, you could almost like put on a movie or two.
Well, it still had a disk drive, so you could bring your movies with you on disk.
That is true.
Didn't necessarily need to be on the computer. In August 2006, the Mac Pro was revealed as a replacement for the Power Mac G5, and that was the final computer Apple moved to Intel chips. So we wrapped it up in under a year.
Well, to be fair, they had a lot fewer SKUs back then.
Yeah, and also Intel had all these chips ready to go. Like these were just kind of what they were selling in PCs at the time. So the base model Mac Pro was priced at $2,499, and it had two 2.6 gigahertz dual-core Intel Xeon processors. It had a gig of RAM expandable to 16 gigs, an NVIDIA GeForce 7300 GT graphics card, a 250 gigabyte hard drive, and 4 PCI Express slots. And then there were more expensive models that went up to 3 gigahertz Xeon CPUs. So hey, they finally got a 3 gigahertz chip in these things, and 4 500 gigabyte hard drives, and there were options for different graphics cards and all that fun stuff. The Mac Pro used normal air cooling on all models instead of the crazy water cooling setup that was required on those late Power Mac G5 desktops. I did find one person on the Mac Resource Forum that was talking about how they switched out their Power Mac G5 in, I think it was a home office, for the 2.6 gigahertz Mac Pro. And they said that their G5 used 140 watts of power while idle, while not doing anything. And under max load, their G5 was using 604 watts. And then when they got their 2.6 gigahertz Mac Pro, it used actually more power while idling. It was 171 watts. I don't know what graphics cards or whatever else they got. But the max power usage was 250 watts. So that's a 2.4 times reduction in max power usage. So it's not putting out as much heat and not requiring as much power. for the intensive tasks.
Right.
640 watts, that's crazy. That is like in modern times, that is like a super high-end gaming PC. You got like the graphics cards that have like 3 PCI Express slots. That is an insane amount of power.
So what you're saying is you could run an electric car off of this.
I'm saying
Not
that
quite, but
I'm saying that I think someone at IBM has to answer for the G5. I think there's a good chance these computers like sped up climate change.
I was just gonna say these were the original cryptocurrency.
Yeah. Like how many polar bears had to die so you could run like a blur filter on Photoshop? I think it was probably a lot. So by most accounts, this Intel transition was a pretty good success. I found a couple interesting articles from the time. Here's a review of the MacBook by Jonathan M. Gitlin for Ars Technica. He said, quote, "Right off the bat, the move from PowerPC to Intel is pronounced. As mentioned earlier, startup times are much faster, and most applications feel a lot more responsive than before. The iLife and iWork suites in particular are much more usable than they were in PowerPC land. A notable exception to this is Microsoft Entourage, no doubt thanks to the fact that Office 2004 is not a universal binary and has to run in Rosetta, the PowerPC emulator. Perhaps the most marked difference I notice in day-to-day use is how much better multimedia performance is. Flash animation is no longer something to be feared, and processor-intensive WMV and MP4 files play without dropping frames." Quote.
Okay, I object. Flash is still something to be feared. We did a whole episode on this. Just 100% best move, stay away.
It's so funny. That first thing he mentions, like, oh, Flash actually works now.
Well, that was the standard of here's how we can bork a whole computer. Just run Flash on it.
The bar is so low. So he went on to say, quote, "Temperature output can always be a worry with laptops, and both of my previous metal-coated PowerBooks had the propensity to get more than a little warm. The MacBook doesn't seem to share that trait, and the temperature monitor indicated that processor temperatures remained around or below 60°C during normal usage. One of the most important considerations for road warriors and laptop users is battery life, and here the MacBook does not disappoint. Okay, I never saw the frankly ludicrous 6 hours that Apple claims, but more than 3.5 hours of constant use was easily achieved. The battery itself is a monster compared to the unit in my old PowerBook, which for the past few years has been inadequate to get me through even a short haul flight." Quote.
Ludicrous 6 hours. Ludicrous.
It was a different time.
It was.
Also, this is exactly how you talk about gaming laptops now.
Oh yeah, 100%. But I mean, those are meant to be made fun of.
Here's a section from a Macworld review of the 15-inch MacBook Pro by Lucy Hadersley. She said, quote, "As it stands, the new Core 2 Duo MacBook Pro represents a step forward in processor speed, and getting 2 gigs of memory as standard is a bonus. However, one of our main gripes with the original MacBook Pro was that it didn't address the issue of design. All the updates go on under the surface. The MacBook with its stylish new look represents the leap forward in laptop design that we were looking for. And it's no surprise that the MacBook is outselling the MacBook Pro by a large margin. Once again, we find ourselves calling on Apple to bring Jonathan Ive into the picture and request a redesign of the MacBook Pro." Quote.
Jonathan.
You don't want Jonathan. Don't bring him into this.
He's the enforcer.
He will make the laptop look so cool and so thin, and also it will not work.
And no ports.
No
None.
port. You don't no ports.
I have altered the port count. Pray I do not alter it further.
So the last segment I've got here is from an Ars Technica review of the Mac Pro by Eric Benjamin. He said, quote, "Going from a dual 2.5 GHz Power Mac G5 to a quad-core 2.6 GHz Xeon doesn't feel that much different under normal usage. Both machines feel about as equally responsive, although the Mac Pro does appear to boot up much quicker. Really, under everyday load, this machine doesn't feel that different than the other Macs I use on a day-to-day basis. although it's far more responsive than my PowerBook G4. The two biggest questions with usage will likely be how well does Windows run, and how well do non-universal binary applications run? In short, good and good. Once I was able to get Windows installed and running, it was great, though a little odd, and Rosetta application performance was also solid. Quote. So pretty good.
Very good.
You know, some complaints about like the design's not really changing on some of these computers, but definitely an upgrade. Okay, so Apple's switch to Intel processors had a fun side effect. It was now possible to run Mac OS X on normal x86 PCs. Mac OS X was closed source software, but the core kernel and some of the other operating system code were partially open source, so that made it easier to modify the bootloader and the other parts that were made to restrict Mac OS X to only Intel Macs, and all those could be modified to make it run on a normal PC. So one thing that I didn't know is that hacked versions of Mac OS X started showing up in 2005, which was before Apple's Intel Macs were shipping. So you could run Mac OS X on a PC before Apple had their Intel Macs out the door.
Nice.
I've got a Wired article from August 2005. It says, quote, imagine if your next Mac cost you only $300 and ran faster than any G4 or G5 you've ever used. That future may already be unfolding. Hackers have found a way to bypass a chip designed to prevent the macOS from running on non-Apple PCs, which are often cheaper than Macs. Some of the hackers are running the tweaked version of the operating system on their PCs natively. Others are using the system with VMware, which allows the macOS to support more PC hardware. Hackers and curious computer users this week have been downloading the modified Mac OS X for PCs nicknamed OS x86 from the BitTorrent file distribution system. OS x86 is designed to run on Apple computers' next generation of hardware, which some call Mac Intels and others Mactels, because the machines will run on Intel processors rather than the PowerPC processor used in current Macs. The hacked version is based on pirated software, which came from copies of the operating system sent to participants in the Apple Developer Connection. The ADC participants also received Mac Intel computers for testing and development. Quote. So Apple sent out those computers, and I was reading about this a little bit. I think the initial protection was there was a like a TPM module on the motherboard, and the OS wouldn't boot without that there. Apparently didn't take people long to bypass that. The first Intel Macs shipped with Mac OS X 10.4.4, and that was modified from that initial software, because the final Intel Macs, I think, just had protection in like the EFI bootloader. So it was a little bit of a different method, but it didn't take long for people to get around that. And that started a ongoing cat and mouse game where Apple would release OS updates that broke these workarounds, which were later patched again, and sometimes the patches were like kernel modifications or something else, and this eventually turned into just being called Hackintosh. So that's a topic that's like huge that I don't have time to fully get into here, but I did want to mention that was a thing.
Oh, it was very much a thing, definitely.
Yeah, I did have a Hackintosh. I put one of those like weird custom distributions of Snow Leopard on my EPC netbook. So I had a Mac OS X netbook. It ran great. That was pretty cool for the time.
I never built a Hackintosh. I considered it a lot. But then I just kept coming back to the just watch one day Apple's going to ship an update and then fork your install, and the amount of hours that you would lose from having to recover everything, fix everything, try to get some stuff back. Like at that point, maybe it's worth just buying one.
Yeah, it's like, this is gonna break more often than Linux. So not that fun. Now, one of the interesting things about Apple's x86 Macs is that all of them used Intel chips. Like every single one up until they eventually moved away to their own Apple Silicon chips in 2020. Every single one with it was an Intel CPU. AMD later claimed that Intel had an exclusivity deal with Apple, which actually blocked them from making processors for Mac computers. AMD's senior vice president of legal affairs, Tom McCoy, said in 2009, quote, "They made a deal when they were porting over from PowerPC to x86 as to how much Intel was willing to pay for that port. My guess is that Intel asked for and won exclusivity in return for the help that they gave Apple to port. That deal will not be exclusive forever, and when that exclusivity is over, I'm sure they, Apple, will choose on the merits. We'll have a chance to compete for Apple's business when Apple is ready." Quote. Intel denied that claim. They gave a statement to CNET that said, quote, "Intel won the business based on the merits of its technology and product roadmaps, which included superb mobile processors and our 45nm high-K-based processor roadmap. What has resulted from this decision is tremendous product and market innovation. If Intel technology did not perform well and our product roadmap was not strong, customers would go elsewhere." Quote.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I buy that. AMD's argument was like, Apple can't buy our chips because Intel won't let them. But was AMD's chips worth, buying? I don't know, honestly. I know for a while around this time, AMD was kind of running into that issue with their desktop chips where they were just like pumping up power usage to try to get more performance out of them. And their laptop chips weren't great, which is important to Apple. I think Intel for this entire period was just like probably the better option. Maybe Apple could have made like a Mac Pro with like AMD's top end stuff. I don't know if that would have made sense though. But I thought that was interesting that AMD made that argument.
Yeah. Well, this wasn't exactly the time, but it was like kind of the end of the time when their chips were sort of notoriously they were basically just pure heat pumps. Like you turn on the computer and while it's in boot, it could almost melt itself. So yeah, it wasn't a great time for AMD.
So now that all of the Macs were running Intel processors, and they were great, and everyone loved them, it was time to move on from PowerPC. Apple released Mac OS X 10.5 Leopard in October 2007, which raised the minimum requirement to a G4 or G5 processor with a speed of at least 867 megahertz and faster. So that cut off all of the G3 Macs and some of the earlier G4 Macs. And then in 2009, Apple released Mac OS X 10.6 Snow Leopard, which dropped all support for PowerPC Macs. It only ran on Intel Macs. There were some developer previews that ran on PowerPC Macs, but the final release did not. So that was the end of OS X updates for PowerPC Macs. But a lot of the like applications and services, that continued working. They were putting out updates for some of those apps for PowerPC Macs for a little while longer. Kind of around 2010 and 2011 is when support for PowerPC ended. So Microsoft Office 2008 was the final release for PowerPC Macs when they made Office 2011 in 2011. That required an Intel Mac. Adobe dropped support for Photoshop, Illustrator, and its other core creative apps with the Creative Suite 5 in 2010. And some of their apps had already needed an Intel CPU, but that was like the end of everything else. When Google Chrome was released as a beta for Mac in 2009, it only supported Intel Macs. There was never a Chrome for PowerPC. The last Firefox version that supported PowerPC was Firefox 3.6.28 in 2010. There was an unofficial fork called 10.4fox that kept like backporting some of the Firefox changes after that point. I actually used 10.4fox back in the day. It was pretty cool. As far as I can tell, Apple's last application update for PowerPC Macs was iTunes 10.6.3 in June of 2012. So that was it. In July of 2011, Apple released macOS X 10.7 Lion, which removed the Rosetta compatibility layer. So Intel Macs could not run PowerPC apps anymore. And that was like a little bit annoying because there were still some older apps that never got updated, but it was mostly annoying for games because a lot of those games would just never get updated.
Yeah, stuff's always got to get left behind.
So that was the end of Apple's PowerPC transition. But I wanted to end this episode talking about what happened to PowerPC after Apple. Where'd it go? So in 2005, the same year Apple announced it was moving away from PowerPC processors, Microsoft released the Xbox 360 game console with a custom PowerPC chip called XCPU. And then the next year, Sony released the PlayStation 3, which used a custom dual-core PowerPC chip called the Cell processor that was developed in collaboration between Sony, Toshiba, and IBM. The Cell processor ended up being kind of infamous. Like it made the PS3 much more difficult to develop games for because it was this very weird architecture.
But it also turned out to be extraordinarily powerful and very popular with, I believe, the U.S. military.
Yeah. Like there was eventually there was a mode on the earlier PS3s where you could install Linux on them, and it was like a Linux port for PowerPC. So you could use the PS3 as like a weird server if you wanted to, or a desktop computer. And then that same year, Nintendo released the Nintendo Wii, which also had a PowerPC based processor, but that was, I think, mostly for backwards compatibility and easy porting because the GameCube from before the Wii had a PowerPC chip. Now, Sony and Microsoft switched to x86 processors for the next generation of consoles, the Xbox One and PlayStation 4. Both of those CPUs were manufactured by AMD, but Nintendo continued using PowerPC for one more console, the Wii U. I think, again, for the backwards compatibility stuff. In 2013, the Open Power Consortium was created to coordinate development and licensing for the CPU architecture. By this point, the PowerPC name had mostly been dropped, and it was now called Power ISA. And the Power ISA is still used in some servers, primarily ones manufactured by IBM. There's still like Linux for it. And the latest Power 10 architecture is a 7-nanometer design fabricated by Samsung. So there's still PowerPC chips. They're mostly just used in servers and a few other embedded things. I think ARM has kind of eaten up all the embedded devices.
Well, not exclusively ARM, but yeah.
Yeah, like ARM and RISC. So yeah, that is Apple's Intel transition.
And boy, are they happy they did it. It massively improved their sales. Not right away, it took a few years, but you could see a very tangible difference where Macs suddenly became viable to people who maybe wanted to have them, even if only just to install Windows on it. But the sudden access to software that was built for x86 was game-changing.
That's all I have. Cody, do you have any plugs?
I don't have any at the moment, which, that's probably good because Apple is anti-plug for the most part. But yeah, find me on the socials. That's the best thing.
Excellent. TechTales is on Mastodon at techtales@mas.to. If you want to go follow the show. All the links to everything we talked about are in the show notes. And there's also links to support the show if you want to do that. And thank you for listening, and we'll be back in your podcast feed soon.
Good night, everybody.